Welcome to the U.S. Manufacturing Today podcast, your hub of information about the U.S. manufacturing and distribution industry. Brought to you by Variable, the on-demand labor solution revitalizing and optimizing your operation, enabling just-in-time response to demand, more efficient production, and lower cost per unit. And now your host and head of Reindustrialization at Variable, Matt Horine.
Welcome to U.S. Manufacturing Today, the podcast powered by Variable, where we talk with the leaders, innovators, and changemakers shaping the future of American industry, along with providing regular updates on the state of manufacturing, the changing policy landscape, and more. Today is a solo episode, and it's because the last 2 weeks have produced more consequential news for American manufacturing than the previous 6 months combined. And most of it is flying under the radar because everyone's obsessing over things like tariff refund headlines and other things that are top of mind. But we're going to connect some dots that I think most people aren't connecting yet. We've got 4 stories converging right now that, when you put them together, paint a picture that I genuinely believe represents the most significant industrial moment this country has seen since World War II. A PMI signal that is quietly telling us something important about where in the manufacturing cycle we're at, a freight market setting up for a transition that operators need to prepare for right now, a set of Defense Production Act moves out of the administration this week that are historic in their scope, and this one stopped me pretty cold, the Pentagon reaching out to Ford and General Motors to ask if they can build weapons on their assembly lines. So let's get into it. And we'll start with the data because the data is actually really good right now if you know how to read it. The ISM manufacturing PMI came in at 52.7 in March. That's the third straight month of expansion, the first time we've had 3 consecutive months in expansion territory in over 2 years. Something we covered in episode 51, but it's important to get into the details. Because the S&P Global version climbed to 52.4, exceeding market expectations, with new orders posting their strongest rise since October of last year. Now, the media covers PMI like a weather report. It went up, it went down, here's a number, but what the PMI is actually telling you when you read the component data is a story about what's happening underneath the headlines. Transportation equipment expanded, computer and electronic products expanded, machinery expanded, fabricated metals expanded, primary metals expanded. 13 out of 18 manufacturing industries reported growth in March. Business confidence hit a 13-month high. New orders expanded for the third straight month after 4 consecutive months in contraction. And here's the part I want to sit with you in the audience. We are 3 months into a manufacturing expansion that started in January, a month when the ISM PMI jumped from 47.9 to 52.6, the biggest single month jump in over 3 years, and it has held and grown in February and March. The economy has now been in continuous expansion for 17 months. The manufacturing sector is catching up to that expansion, and the leading indicator, which is new orders, is in expansion territory for the third straight month. That's not a blip, that is a trend establishing itself. The one caveat I'll give you is price pressures are real. The prices sub-index hit its highest reading since June of 2022, driven by steel, aluminum, and tariff pass-through cost. That's a little bit of a headwind, but it's a headwind that domestic producers can navigate a lot better than their overseas competitors right now, and I'll come back to that. Now let's talk about freight again, because what's happening in the trucking market right now is directly connected to where manufacturing goes from here. The freight market entered 2026 in what ACT Research calls a supply-driven tightening phase. Let me translate that. It means the number of trucks available to haul your goods has been shrinking, not because demand exploded, but because carriers have been exiting the market for over 2 straight years. Many have said it was a freight recession. Margins got cut to the bone, small operators folded, fleet investment stalled, driver availability was tightening at the fastest pace in several years. C.H. Robinson revised their 2026 truckload rate outlook upward to approximately 8% year-over-year growth. Spot rates have already overtaken contract rates in many lanes, and here's the structural piece: the driver pool is getting tighter from multiple directions. New FMCSA regulations on non-domiciled carriers and an enforcement environment that is pulling capacity out of the market. What this means for manufacturers is simple. The freight bill is going up in the second half of 2026. It's not speculation. The capacity math is very clear, and when manufacturing demand, which is now expanding based on 3 consecutive months of PMI data, meets a freight market with less available capacity, rates will move up. The operators who are locking in contract rates now, building dedicated carrier relationships now, and thinking about their logistics strategy as a competitive advantage rather than a line item are going to be in a fundamentally better position than the ones who wait. That is the freight setup, and it's tightening in real time. Now we get to the part of today's episode that I think is genuinely underappreciated and was announced over the past week and is a little bit below the headlines. The White House issued a series of presidential determinations invoking Section 303 of the Defense Production Act, one of the most powerful peacetime industrial tools available to an American administration or president. And they used it across 5 categories simultaneously: petroleum production, refining and logistics capacity, electric grid infrastructure, like transformers, transmission lines, high voltage components, electrical steel, large-scale energy project development, natural gas and LNG capacity, and coal supply chains. The White House literally declared in legal language that domestic petroleum production, refining, and logistics are essential to national defense, and that without federal intervention, U.S. industry cannot be expected to provide these capabilities in a timely manner due to financing risks, regulatory delays, and market barriers. So we're now in a situation where the President of the United States just classified domestic energy infrastructure as a national defense asset and used wartime industrial powers to fund its expansion. This is now national policy, something people have been wondering why we haven't done this in the first place, among many other things. But it's a presidential determination published in the Federal Register, with real legal authority to make purchases, provide loan commitments, and fund production expansion without normal regulatory constraints. For manufacturers, this is enormous. Energy is an input cost that touches everything we make. When the federal government commits to expanding domestic petroleum refining capacity, securing grid infrastructure, and building out LNG and natural gas supply, it is making a structural bet on cheaper, more reliable domestic energy for the long term. That is a tailwind for American production that our competitors in Europe and Asia simply cannot match right now. Germany is paying 3 to 4 times what American manufacturers pay for industrial electricity. Japan is importing LNG at spot prices. China is managing rolling energy shortfalls. The Defense Production Act just made domestic energy a manufacturing competitive advantage, and most of the financial press missed it entirely because they were writing about tariffs. Here's the backdrop you need to understand why the Defense Production Act moves on energy this week are so significant. The U.S. is currently producing 24 million barrels per day of oil and liquid fuels, which is more than Russia and Saudi Arabia combined. Crude oil production alone set an all-time record of 13.6 million barrels per day in 2025, and it's expected to hold at those levels or grow this year. On LNG, the numbers are even more striking. In 2025, the United States became the first country to export more than 100 million tons of LNG in a single year. That is enough to meaningfully supply Europe, Asia, and still have energy to spare domestically. And the export story is accelerating in real time. Total U.S. petroleum products exports hit 7 million barrels per day in January of this year, about 8% higher than the same period last year, with diesel exports to Europe more than doubling as sanctions on Russian crude reshuffled global oil flows. Let that sink in from a manufacturing cost perspective. The same country that is the world's largest oil producer, the world's largest LNG exporter, and now invoking the Defense Production Act to further expand domestic refining and grid infrastructure, that country's manufacturers are buying their energy inputs at prices that their German and Japanese competitors can't touch. European industrial electricity rates are running 3 to 4 times what American manufacturers pay. Japan is buying LNG at spot prices on a market we're increasingly setting. And while global energy prices are volatile due to Middle East conflict and sanctions reshuffling, the structural position of the American producer, sitting on top of the world's most productive shale basins with expanding export terminals and now federal wartime powers backing further domestic capacity build-out, is as strong as it has ever been in modern history. The Defense Production Act moves this week weren't just about energy, they're about locking in a manufacturing cost advantage that is structural, durable, and something our competitors simply cannot replicate. American energy dominance is American manufacturing competitiveness. And now for the story that I genuinely could not believe when I read it last week. The Pentagon, the Department of War, reached out to Ford Motor Company CEO Jim Farley and General Motors CEO Mary Barra to ask if their companies could shift production capacity towards weapons manufacturing. Defense officials asked explicitly, could you rapidly retool to backstop traditional defense contractors? Could you produce weapon systems, military equipment, or munitions components? The context: the U.S. military has been burning through inventory. The Iran conflict, commitments to allies, the pace of drone and munitions consumption, the traditional defense industrial base is under extreme strain. And the Pentagon, which is simultaneously requesting a $1.5 trillion budget for fiscal year 2027, a 42% increase over last year, is looking beyond Lockheed and Raytheon for capacity. They went to Detroit. Now, analysis and analysts are quick to point out the challenges. Ford is running at 73% capacity utilization. GM is at about 79%. Those are not bad numbers, but they're not the numbers of companies with massive idle capacity to throw at tank production. And the UAW has noted that they haven't been part of any of those discussions yet. There are real questions about retooling timelines, contracting frameworks, and whether you can make F-150s next to armored vehicles. But we've done it before. But here's what I want you to hear past the logistics debate. The Pentagon reaching out to Detroit automakers is not a production plan. It is a signal that the United States government sending the clearest possible message that it views its commercial manufacturing base part of its national security architecture. That's the reindustrialization thesis made explicit. In World War II, Ford built bombers, General Motors built tanks and aircraft engines. Even Singer Sewing Machine made bomb sights. The whole country pivoted to production because production was survival. We're not in World War II, but we are in a world where munitions stockpiles are depleted, where the defense industrial base has atrophied from decades of outsourcing and offshoring, and where the Pentagon is spending a $152 billion this fiscal year alone through reconciliation, with $500 billion of that going specifically to munitions supply chain upgrades, advanced manufacturing for propellers, AI, automation at shipyards, next-generation submarine production, and drone production. The defense budget is a demand signal to American industry if read correctly. And that demand signal just got turned up to a volume we haven't had in a generation. So let's bring this one home because that's what the show is about. The PMI is in expansion, freight capacity is tightening, the Defense Production Act just mobilized federal resources behind domestic energy infrastructure. And the Pentagon is asking automakers to think about going on a wartime footing. These are not four separate stories, they are one story. They are the story of American reindustrialization gaining momentum from multiple directions at once: tariff policy, defense spending, energy security and dominance, and the gradual reshoring of supply chains that simply cannot survive another disruption like 2020. There are still real headwinds. Input costs are elevated, reshoring takes time and capital, the labor gap in manufacturing, or labor access as we like to put it, isn't closing overnight, and people will have to be creative and think about how to address it. And freight rates going up is a cost increase, not just an opportunity. But the direction of travel is clear, and the operators who are positioning now, investing in domestic capacity, building flexible workforce strategies or on-demand strategies, and locking in logistics partnerships, and paying attention to where defense dollars are actually flowing, are the ones who will look back at 2026 as the year the tide turned. The reindustrialization of America is not a political talking point. It's showing up in the PMI, it's showing up in freight data, it's now showing up in national policy. And it is showing up in the fact that the Pentagon is reaching out to some of our biggest automakers to keep building the arsenal of democracy. We're going to keep tracking this and sharing what we see on the ground, and we have some exciting guests coming up in the near future to address these topics. And to stay ahead of the curve and to help plan your strategy, please check out our website at variableops.com and under the resources section titled Trump 2.0, where you can see the framework around upcoming policies and how they will impact you as a manufacturer. If you're on socials, give us a follow on LinkedIn, X, Truth, or Instagram. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free to follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube and leave us a rating, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you again for joining us and learning more about how you can make your way.